Chapter 41. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. The fake one is easier to control. She finally composed herself after getting into the car. She turned to look at Grandfather Jiang, who was bringing her to the Yuns to confront them. Grandfather Jiang, do you believe me? She must make sure of this. Otherwise, when her biological mother, Liang Shuqin, ended up bringing out all sorts of evidence and claims there was a thief when she was the actual thief, the situation would harm Yunxi instead. I'm already an old man, but I still have enough eyesight to see through people. Don't worry, girl. You're the granddaughter. In law that I've accepted, so Grandfather Jiang would not let you suffer any injustices. Thank you, Grandfather Jiang. Squeezing the jade pendant in her hand, Yunxi sighed quietly. Regardless if it was this lifetime or the previous one, she'd always had weak familial relationships. Instead, strangers offered more warmth and kindness to her. But this also worked out well, since there was less for her to worry about if there was no emotion attached. In this lifetime, she also needed to properly start her life again, aside from sending the people who'd harmed her straight to hell. However, Grandfather Yun and an old friend had happened to go to the neighboring town to visit their friends from the countryside. They hadn't returned yet, so Grandfather Jiang and Yunxi had made a trip to the Yuns for nothing. As soon as Liang Shuqin heard that Yunxi was outside, she took Liang Sini and Yun Xiling running to the door. They were terrified that she would disappear again if they were even a second too late. But she instantly sensed that something was wrong when she saw Grandfather Jiang standing at the door. She hadn't expected the wretched girl to actually take the jade pendant to go find Grandfather Jiang. They couldn't afford to cross the Jiangs, but she didn't want to let this star of death into her house either. She was stuck between a rock and a hard place, so she didn't know what to do at that moment. Yun Xiling was terrified that her beautiful dream of marrying into the Jiangs would be dashed, so she quickly grabbed Liang Shuqin's hand and quietly whispered into her ear. Mom, you have to insist that she stole the jade pendant, no matter what happens, and that she is the fake Yunxi. If you let her into our house, not only will I lose out on the marriage, but this is also a critical moment for Dad since he is about to get a promotion. What if she impacts Dad's fortune? Don't forget, you need to become the wife of the director. There were some differences between the real and fake Yun Zais. They couldn't control the real one, and she would also bring misfortune to their entire family. If she were to return to the Yun family, then she would end up being the one who got to marry into the Jiang family. Yun Xiling wouldn't have any hopes at all. But the fake one was a different story. She owed them everything, so she would certainly be obedient. If Yun Xiling were to ask Liang Sini to give the marriage to her, she would certainly agree. As opposed to letting the real one in and cursing them, they might as well support this fake one. At least she brought in ample benefits. Liang Shuqin had already considered these points, but she hadn't expected that wretched girl to be able to find the Jiangs even though she had lived in the countryside for so many years now. As if things will be that easy. Now that Grandmother Jiang is also involved, I can't afford to offend him at all. You're the biological mother, so it's impossible for you to be unable to recognize your own child. She's fake as long as you say she's fake, so Grandfather Jiang will be sure to believe you. You haven't even heard what they have to say yet, so how can we be sure that Grandfather Jiang isn't actually on our side? We shouldn't mess with our own heads before anything even happens. Liang Sini nodded as she chimed in as well, that's right. She only has the jade pendant, while I have the bracelets and identification. We have confidence. Grandfather Jiang can't possibly believe a scammer he doesn't know, instead of us. Liang Shuqin thought this made sense when she thought about it, and they aligned themselves to battle against the external force. She refused to believe that she would be crushed by one wretched girl. Liang Shuqin felt like her hope had returned when she thought of this. But she had no idea that, aside from the jade pendant, the Jiangs also owed Yunxi the great favor of saving their heir's life. Senior Mr. Jiang, you dropped by. Liang Shuqin smiled politely as she opened the door and inclined her body to block the side of where Yunxi stood. She was determined to not let her past the door. Grandfather Jiang was also someone with a bad temper. He glanced at Liang Xiuqin and sneered coldly, "I heard that you're refusing to let Yunxi back home. Is that true? Senior Mr. Jiang, you must be joking. Yunxi came back a long time ago and has been home this entire time." Chapter 42. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Make them beg for you to go home. Liang Xiuqin discreetly glared at Yunxi to warn her against speaking rashly. Yunxi raised a brow and gave her an innocent look in return. She completely ignored the threatening and warning look in Liang Xiuqin's eyes. She's been home the entire time. Grandfather Jiang glanced at Liang Xiuqin, sneering derisively. Looks like Yunxi hadn't been lying, Liang Xiuqin actually wasn't letting her come home. No wonder Liang Xiuqin had been cruel enough to discard Yunxi in the countryside when she had been only a few months old and still breastfeeding. She hadn't visited Yunxi once in over 10 years, so she truly didn't have a conscience as a mother. Grandfather Jiang pointed to the demure and guilty-looking Liang Xini and frowned deeply. "You're talking about this impostor here." Liang Xiuqin's expression froze when she was directly caught in the act, so her smile became a bit ugly. "Senior Mr. Jiang, what do you mean by impostor? This is the real Yunxi. So yours is real, and mine is actually fake. Yunxi has the Jiang's jade pendant on her, so what does your impostor have?" Grandfather Jiang dragged Yunxi to his side and glanced coldly at Liang Xiuqin. He was infuriated by her shamelessness. It'd be one thing for a stepmother to reject a daughter, but she so happened to be the biological daughter. Liang Xiuqin quickly dragged Liang Xini over as well. "Senior Mr. Jiang, you've really mistaken her for the wrong person. This is actually my daughter, Yunxi. She has the silver bracelets I gave her when she was young, and the name on her identification is also Yunxi. I sent someone to personally bring her home from the countryside. The wretched girl standing next to you is actually a thief. She stole Yunxi's jade pendant from the villa complex today." L.RG Liang Xini could already guess the identity of Grandfather Liang, so she wanted nothing more but to use all her tricks to convince him to believe her. It didn't matter, even if she had to give the arranged marriage to Yun Xiling. As long as she could earn the favor of Grandfather Jiang, perhaps the Yuns would have to beg for her help and respect her in the future. "That's right. Senior Mr. Jiang, she was the one who came to the villa complex this morning to swindle us. She claims that she is Yunxi and even stole my jade pendant. We were just planning on calling the police." "Nonsense." Grandfather Jiang sneered, his expression becoming increasingly ugly. "My grandson returned from Muyan yesterday and so happened to be in the same coach as Yunxi. He already saw Yunxi holding the jade pendant when they'd been on the train yesterday, and you dare to say that Yunxi stole the jade pendant." He finally realized that Liang Xiuqin didn't intend on showing him any respect today. Great. This was great. He had gone through more than half his life and no one has ever dared to disrespect him like this. "Your eldest grandson, He." Liang Xiuqin's face fell. She'd never expected such a thing to happen. Her words just now were basically a slap to her own face. With Chenny Chen as a witness, a change in her tune would be tantamount to confessing what she had done. She thought about it over and over again, realizing that she could only continue attempting to fool him. "Senior Mr. Jiang, don't be tricked by this wretched girl. She's actually a thief. How could I mistake my own daughter for someone else?" Grandfather Jiang shouted angrily, "You mean that I'm so old I've become foolish?" "No. That's not what I meant." "Then what you are trying to say? You're refusing to accept your actual daughter, but you are accepting an impostor, instead. You really think that I'm so easily fooled?" "Senior Mr. Jiang." Liang Xiuqin had already begun to panic as she wrung her hands with a conflicted expression. What kind of drug did this wretched girl give Senior Mr. Jiang? How could he believe her so unconditionally? "That's fine. You don't need to say anything else. Liang Shuqin, I'll tell you that our Jiang family only recognizes Yun Shi as my granddaughter. Law. Your impostor shouldn't even dream of ever stepping inside our home. So you don't want Yun Shi to come home? Fine. I'll have someone call old Yun back home so he can personally take his granddaughter back home. We will also send someone to Muyang to investigate who on earth this impostor actually is, so you'd better take responsibility for all the things you've said today. Our family isn't so easily fooled. Girl, let's go back. You can live at our house if she isn't letting you go home. Make them beg for you to come back. Grandfather Jiang sneered before taking Yun Shi back to the car. Although he was now retired, he still had ways to make things difficult for the Yuns. Chapter 43. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Truly incorrigible Yun Shi didn't even get to say anything before she was dragged off by Grandfather Jiang. Grandfather Yun wasn't home, and Liang Shuqin vehemently denied the truth, so it didn't matter what Yun Shi said. Grandfather Jiang was probably infuriated by Liang Shuqin today, and as soon as he got in the car, he ordered the housekeeper to call his second son to exert pressure on Yun Yuanfeng. O.org. He also angrily dialed Grandfather Yun's phone number and made him come pick up his granddaughter from the Jiangs early the next morning. Grandfather Yun was confused about what had happened. Why didn't his granddaughter stay home after returning to Jingdu, but run off to the Jiangs, instead, troubling Grandfather Jiang? Grandfather Jiang's explosive male temper instantly reared its head. Once it was triggered, nothing could stop it, and he shouted angrily as he explained the entire situation. Finally, Grandfather Jiang directly retorted, "Since your Yun family doesn't want this granddaughter anymore, our Jiang family will adopt her." Grandfather Yun finally understood the seriousness of the situation and continuously promised he would make sure to visit them tomorrow and reclaim his granddaughter. Yun Shi sat on the sidelines as she listened to Grandfather Jiang act so decisively, even though he was already at such an elderly age. These were obviously the methods of a man who had commanded 1,000 troops when he was younger. Grandfather Jiang was truly impressive. As such a legendary figure, he was youthful in even his old age and no less protective than a younger person when it came to helping the weak. Yun Shi was very touched to see him protect her to this extent, even though she was just a younger person whom he'd only met a few times. She'd originally intended to use a few more tricks to make the Yuns come to escort her home, but Grandfather Jiang had already stood up for her, so she didn't even need to waste her efforts. Grandfather Jiang did the work of two people as soon as he stepped in. Even Yun Shi's grandmother was his subordinate, so she refused to believe that Liang Shuqin would continue to protect that impostor and try to use more tricks up her sleeves. When she returned to the Yun family, she would take her time to get rid of all her obstacles. The villa complex was a place full of gossip. News of the commotion caused by Grandfather Jiang almost instantly circulated throughout the entire complex. Various versions of the rumors were vividly retold, that Liang Shuqin had found an impostor to replace her own daughter in order to gain the support of the Jiangs but had ended up angering them instead. They also said that Liang Shuqin was superstitious and afraid that her daughter would curse their family, so she'd accepted an impostor as her daughter. When the Jiangs had brought her real daughter home, she vehemently rejected her. As the rumors circulated, everyone berated Liang Shuqin for having no conscience and rejecting her real daughter for an impostor. Grandfather Yun's second daughter Law reported the incident to him as soon as he came home. He was completely enraged when he took a glance at the girl standing next to Liang Shuqin. "Look at what you've done. Who do you think you are, compared to someone like Senior Mr. Jiang? Don't think that you people can do as they please just because he treats an inconsequential person like me as a friend. I don't even have that much face to spare, so where'd you get the confidence to think you can argue with him?" "Dad." Liang Shuqin was pent up with anger. She was especially humiliated by how her sister Law, Yao Ying, had embellished the story when she told it to Grandfather Jiang. "Dad. What Yao Ying told you isn't true. Senior Mr. Jiang was deceived. This is our real Yun Shi." "Shut up. You think I'm so old I've become foolish? I already had someone call Muyang to investigate this last night. You are fully aware of who the person standing next to you is. Immediately come with me to the Jiangs to give them a humble apology and bring Yunshi home. Dad. Liang Xiuqin realized she couldn't keep this under wraps anymore, so she could only implore him with emotions and move him with logic. The fortune teller said that wretched girl is destined to bring misfortune to the family, so she'll curse us if we let her stay in her home. This is a critical time for Yuan Feng, he is about to get a promotion. If she comes into our household, what happens if she impacts his future? Liang Xiuqin was deathly afraid that grandfather Yun wouldn't believe her, so she quickly dragged Liang Xini over and explained gently, Xini is destined for a life of wealth and will bring fortune to our family. It doesn't matter if she's real or fake as long as we have a daughter. It doesn't even matter who it is. You. Grandfather Yun's face turned pale with anger when he heard her words. He had never heard someone give such a superstitious and shameless explanation. You're truly incorrigible. I've never seen a mother act like you. If we offend the Jiangs, don't you even worry about having someone bring misfortune to the entire family. The Jiangs will be able to bring Yuan Feng down before that even happens. Wait and see if you don't believe me. Chapter 44. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Her value. Yunshi gave the reason for her arranged marriage with the Jiangs and directly told grandfather Jiang that it was inappropriate for her to stay in their home. Jiang Wanyun really liked Yunshi as well. After persuading grandfather Jiang for some time, he had no choice but to have Yunshi stay one night at the Chen's. Grandfather Chen really liked Yunshi, who was the same age as his own granddaughter. He had 3 grandsons and 1 granddaughter, but his granddaughter's mother was engaged in scientific research. She always kept her daughter with her, so grandfather Jiang couldn't see her even if he wanted to. Also, grandfather Jiang babied his Yunshi, and grandfather Chen was jealous to see this. When he saw Yunshi, it gave him the idea of loving his granddaughter vicariously through Yunshi. Jiang Wanyun brought a few unworn outfits from her niece's room and gave them to Yunshi. Girl, you can stay in Yifei's room tonight. I've already asked the housekeeper to tidy it up for you. Thank you, madam. Hugging the new clothes, Yunshi glanced at the tags that were still attached to them. These were all international brands with high price tags. In her previous lie, she'd had her own exclusive designer. In order to avoid being taken advantage of during business social functions and to save herself for Han Yao Tian, she'd been even willing to make herself look uglier and older. During her best years, she'd walked right past all the beautiful clothes. In this current lifetime, she'd grown up in the countryside and had worn the Liang sisters' hand-me-downs since she had been young. She only had 1 new pair of pants, which were the ones that her auntie had bought for Liang Xini. However, Liang Xini couldn't fit in them and called them old-fashioned, which was why they had been passed down to her. Jiang Wanyun caught the peculiar expression on her face and asked quietly, what is it? You don't like the clothes. You're about the same build as Yifei, so you should be able to fit in them. No, I really like them. This is just the first time I've worn new clothes all my life. Jiang Wanyun recalled how Yunshi had told grandfather Jiang about her life in the countryside and genuinely felt bad for this child who was unloved by her parents. She had always wanted a daughter since they were sweet and intimate with their mothers. But unfortunately, she had a weak uterus and didn't get pregnant very easily, so she hadn't considered having another child after having given birth to her son. When she saw this obedient and likable young girl, she truly spoiled her from the bottom of her heart. She really couldn't understand how Yunshi could have ended up with such a mother. Due to the Jiang status in Jingdu, Liang Xiuqin had no choice but to follow grandfather Yun to the Jiangs to pick up Yunshi. Auntie. Liang Xini clutched Liang Xiuqin's shirt hem with worry as she felt as uneasy as ants on a hot plate. She had been discarded as soon as grandfather Yun had returned home, so the situation had been completely different from her expectations. According to her mother's personality, there was absolutely no way she would allow Yunshi, that wretched girl, to come to Jingdu. However, not only did Yun Shi come here, but she also threatened Liang Xinyi's existence. What on earth did her mother do? Does she even want to enjoy a life of luxury? Don't you worry. Now that you've come here, Auntie won't allow you to get sent home just like this. After considering it carefully, Liang Shuqin knew she could not only stop that star of death from coming home. In order to prevent her from cursing her family, she must keep Liang Xinyi, the lucky star, at home. At the very least, keeping Liang Xinyi here would ward off Yun Shi's bad luck and prevent her from cursing them. Really? You're really letting me stay here? Liang Xinyi already knew she couldn't continue pretending to be Yun Shi, so she only wished to remain in the Yun household now. Yes. You're my niece, so it's not a big deal for me to keep you in our household. But I'm about to start school. The final year of high school is critical. No problem. I'll ask someone to help you transfer schools. You don't need to worry about those things, so you can stay at my house with peace of mind. Okay. Thank you, Auntie. Since her auntie was willing to let her remain in Jingdu, it only proved that it was still useful for her to stay here. She suddenly recalled that her fortune was destined to bring good luck to her family, so this was exactly her biggest advantage. As long as that wretched girl remained in the Yun's home, then Liang Xinyi could continue to stay here with peace of mind. She didn't have to worry about the Yuns treating her badly. But at the crux of it, the identity of the rich heiress of the Yun family was still more important and provided a brighter future. It was all Yun Shi's fault. She had dashed all of Liang Xinyi's dreams. Now that they'd be living under the same roof, she swore to make Yun Shi's life a living hell. Chapter 45. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Adopt a child bride. Grandfather Yun saw that Liang Shuqin still refused to change her terrible habit, so he didn't waste another breath on her before making her go to the Jiangs to bring Yun Shi home. Liang Shuqin and Yun Shi had a weak mother-daughter bond, and as a mother, she hadn't cared about her daughter ever since she'd been young. She'd treated Yun Shi even worse than she had a stranger. As Yun Shi's grandfather, Grandfather Yun was not only harshly scolded by Grandfather Jiang but had the incident circulate all throughout the entire villa complex. He was thoroughly humiliated. The car drove into the Jiang's mansion, and the housekeeper came outside the house to tell Grandfather Yun that the eldest heiress of the Yuns was staying at the Chen's. He asked them to go directly to the Chen's mansion to pick her up. Grandfather Yun was a bit shocked by how the Chens were randomly involved too, so he asked the housekeeper out of curiosity. The housekeeper smiled politely and repeated the entirety of what Grandfather Jiang had instructed him to say from last night. Miss Yun is Mr. Chen's savior. Grandfather Yun must be unaware of that. If it wasn't for Mississippi Yun, Mr. Chen probably wouldn't have survived this time. It was really thanks to Mississippi Yun's amazing medical skills, so she's now the great savior of both the Jiang and Chen families. Liang Shuqin's eyes gleamed as soon as she heard this. Is that true? What happened to Mr. Chen? She'd never thought that Star of Death would actually gain the support of the Chens. If she really became the savior of the Chens, then this act of saving Chen's life would be a very amazing thing for the Yuns. The Jiangs and Chens both belonged to the four great clans of Jingdu. With the support of these two families, as well as the great favor of saving Chen's life, the Yuns would certainly not be rejected if they ever asked these families for help in the future. Looks like this Star of Death wasn't totally useless after all. The housekeeper already had heard about how Miss Yun and Grandfather Jiang had been rejected by the Yuns the day before. Grandfather Jiang had been completely enraged, so as his servant, he was naturally seeing the Yuns as his own enemies as well. Mrs. Yun, why do your questions sound as if you are really hoping that something terrible happens to Mr. Chen? I didn't mean it like that. I was only worried about Mr. Chen. That girl has always lived in the countryside, so she has no manners. What would we ever do if she harmed Mr. Chen? BL.net. The housekeeper shot her a disdainful look. She didn't even care about the survival of her daughter yet had the energy to care about someone else. Grandfather Yun had not seemed to have expected such a thing to happen, so it was no wonder that Grandfather Jiang scolded him so harshly out of the blue the day prior. Grandfather Jiang and Miss Yun are both at the Chen's. Maybe Grandfather Yun should go to the Chen's to have a look. Okay, thanks. Inside the Chen's mansion, breakfast time at the long table was more lively than usual. Both grandfathers especially tried to earn the favor of Yun Shi, so the topics of conversation never ended. Ever since Chen Chen had come downstairs, he'd kept watching Yun Shi. Her long ponytail had transformed into a loose bun on the top of her head, revealing her full and pretty forehead. Her exquisite features were topped with her curly eyelashes and lively, glossy eyes that shimmered with a watery glow. Compared to her dingy and dusty appearance the day before, she now looked more delicate and cute. He couldn't help but recall the country-bumpkin-looking girl he'd seen on the train that day. She had merely changed her clothes, but her aura and appearance had already improved by several degrees. The natural, peaceful demure she exuded especially made him recall a phrase. The times are peaceful. This young girl would probably grow into a stunning, drop-dead beauty one day. If she actually ended up marrying his younger cousin, Chen Chen was actually afraid that his cousin would really end up wasting away her beauty with his kind of personality. Grandfather Chen, Senior Mr. Jiang, Grandfather Yun is here. Bring them to the living room for a cup of tea. We'll be there soon. Grandfather Jiang glanced at Yun Shi, and she also obediently turned her head toward him. There wasn't much emotion on her quiet and tender face. Before Grandfather Chen even opened his mouth, Chen Chen was the first to chime in as the eldest heir. His tone sounded like he was very reluctant to see her leave. Why do we have to let Yun Shi go home? Doesn't her mother reject her? Grandfather Jiang glared at his precious grandson. What do you even know? Someone else's home would never compare to one's own home. With her mother's personality, Yun Shi would only get bullied if she went back. She might as well stay at our house. He then turned to look at Jiang Wanyun and rudely teased his own mother. Mom, how about you adopt Yun Shi as a child bride? Chapter 46. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Mr. Chen is watching with covetous eyes. Everyone's expression changed when they heard the joke that could never come true. Yun Shi looked embarrassed as she squinted maliciously at the cynical eldest heir of the Chens. She squeezed the chopsticks in her hand even tighter. Nonsense. Was this how he repaid someone who saved his life? How dare he make fun of her? However, Chen Chen appeared as if this matter didn't concern him, even though he was the one to have instigated it. He half-smiled as he looked at the angry, young girl sitting across from him. Oh my! I'm so scared. This girl's eyes can kill. Yun Shi directly rolled her eyes at him before digging into her breakfast. She was truly going to ignore him now. His throat seemed to always have the energy to poke fun at her even though it had just healed, so why hadn't she been a bit rougher when she changed his dressing last night? He deserved to die from the pain. Nonsense. Jiang Wanyun kicked her son from under the table and glared at him. You're so disobedient. How can you make fun of Yun Shi? Because her son had opened this can of worms, Jiang Wanyun didn't dare to entertain this idea now, even though she'd thought of it as well. Mom, would you dare say that you weren't thinking the same thing? Also, what's the difference of being the granddaughter.in-law of Grandfather Chen, as compared to being the granddaughter.in-law of Grandfather Jiang? As he said this, he even looked right at the two elderly men giving him solemn glares. Hurry up and shut your mouth. Eat your food. Jiang Wanyun truly couldn't handle this child. He wasn't embarrassed, but she was certainly embarrassed as his mother. Grandfather Chen spoiled his grandson and had always been protective of him. When he heard his grandson say this, he also glanced at Grandfather Jiang like he was inquiring about his opinion. Don't you even think about it. There is a difference between Yun Shi being your or my granddaughter.in-law. She'd either live with the Jiangs or the Chens, so he could see her every day if she lived with the Jiangs. But if she lived at the Jiang's, he would have to ask for grandfather Chen's permission before he could even see her. How could she be filial to him if she didn't even live together with him? Oh, how can you be such an unreasonable old man? Your grandson hasn't even met Yun Shi, so what if he doesn't actually like her? You want to destroy her future with an arranged marriage. You're the unreasonable one. This is my future granddaughter. Law, so you'd better not cause any trouble. Yun Shi sighed quietly as she listened to the two old men start bickering again. She calmly raised a hand. Grandfathers, are you even going to ask me for my opinion as the person being discussed? Both old men turned to look at her. Yun Shi finished her breakfast and chimed in casually, this matter isn't urgent. I'm still young and still need to go to university, and I want to study medicine. Both your grandsons are very outstanding people, but I can't take advantage of your love for me and do as I please without making something of myself. I also need to be good enough to match the talents, tastes, and upbringing of the Jiang and Chen families. What do you think? After all, she already knew about Jiang Henglin's personality from her previous lifetime. He was obviously nothing but a playboy, so she was guaranteed to not attract his attention as long as she made herself a bit uglier. But right now, she still needed her arranged marriage with the Jiangs as support. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to establish herself within the Yun household if the arranged marriage was cancelled. As for Chen Chen, this eldest heir wasn't as easy to deal with. After all, she knew Chen Chen as a ruthless and decisive figure from her previous lifetime. She refused to believe that dark plots and methods didn't lurk under his elegant and gentle face. It appeared that the joke of adopting a child bride had already caused her to realize the threat posed by Chen Chen. She couldn't afford to cross Mu Feiqi or the eldest heir of the Chens, who had harbored ulterior motives she had no ideas about. The two old men nodded in unison when they heard this. Their eyes reflected their admiration for her wisdom. This girl was sensible and polite, so she knew how to look at the big picture. She didn't disrespect them, yet was able to see the long-term path. They truly hadn't misread her as a person. Okay then. We'll do as you say. An agreement had been reached. Grandfather Jiang saw that he didn't need to compromise, so he immediately stood up to end the conversation. Let's go. Grandfather Jiang will take you to see your grandfather. Chapter 47. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Very shameless. Yun Shi stood in the living room as she looked up at her grandfather Yun and Liang Shuqin, who had come to pick her up. In her previous lifetime, she had taken advantage of the relationship between the Jiang and Yun families. As the eldest daughter, her grandfather had loved her quite a bit and never allowed her to suffer any injustices. In Jingdu, the eldest sons and daughters enjoyed the first inheritance rights in the family. In the past 2 decades in Jingdu, the 4 great clans had not produced many heirs. Some clans hadn't even had sons, so inheritance by the eldest daughters had slowly become a type of tradition, and they had begun to stand as equals with the eldest sons. This was also the reason why Yun Shi wanted to return to the Yun family. As the eldest daughter, the family inheritance rights still belonged to her, even if the Yuns had a male heir. She'd lived like too much of a coward in her previous lifetime, so all the good things and everything that had belonged to her had all been given away to Yun Xiling and Yun Chuhan. Aside from grandfather Yun, who truly loved Yun Shi, everyone else in the family had used her as a tool. She would no longer compromise in this lifetime. Nor would she make any concession. Yun Shi, I am your grandfather. Grandfather Yun saw the granddaughter who had been sent away over 10 years ago and had now become an adult. He did feel regret and emotion to see her again after all the years. Grandfather. Yun Shi smiled and discreetly concealed her emotions to make herself appear as if she wasn't being too deliberate or aloof. Jiang Wanyun and grandfather Chen also came out from the dining room. They greeted grandfather Yun, but no one paid any attention to Liang Shuqin as she sent over looks of flattery. Senior Mr. Jiang, I've troubled you. Grandfather Yun looked at his previous boss with awkwardness before sending Liang Xiuqin a look to tell her to get over there. What are you looking at? Hurry up and apologize humbly to Grandfather Jiang. Liang Xiuqin composed herself. Recalling the incredible embarrassment she'd brought down upon herself yesterday, she awkwardly walked up to Grandfather Jiang to apologize. Out of respect for Grandfather Yun, Grandfather Jiang didn't give her a very hard time. You know clearly who is real and who is fake. Our Jiang family will only accept this one Yun Shi. I see her as my granddaughter. Law. If she suffers any injustice when she returns to the Yin family, don't blame me for not giving old Yun any face. These words served as both a reminder and a warning. When said before all these people, it was completely humiliating for Liang Xiuqin. Senior Mr. Zhang's teachings are wise. Liang Xiuqin clenched her hands into tight fists, and she smiled rigidly as she swallowed the bitterness down her throat. She especially wanted to dig a hole in the ground because this was happening with Jiang Wanyun's present. They were both the same age, but one was a rich heiress born to a great clan, and her incomparable prestigious identity was further bolstered by her title as Mrs. Chen. The other was an uncouth woman who'd crawled out of the countryside. Even if she became the wife of the director, she would still belong to a lower class. When she recalled how that wretched girl had saved Jiang Wanyun's precious son, Liang Xiuqin felt the pride return to herself and stood with her back a bit straighter. She turned around to look at Jiang Wanyun with a flattering smile. Mrs. Chen, I heard that Yun Shi rescued Mr. Chen. I wonder, how is he doing right now? We didn't give you any trouble, right? As soon as she spoke the words, the entire living room plunged into silence. Yun Shi curled her lips into a smirk but looked down in silence. If her mother wanted to get in trouble so badly, Yun Shi had no intention of stopping her. She had done a great favor by saving Chen, but she had never asked for any remuneration from beginning to end. She didn't even seem to take it very seriously at all. This was how medical professionals behaved, and it earned respect and admiration from other people. Jiang Wanyun and the Chens would always keep this favor in mind. But when Liang Xiuqin said the words with her mouth, they took on a very different meaning. Liang Xiuqin wasn't the one to rescue Chen, yet she was mentioning the incident with everyone present. Anyone who had a brain could tell exactly what she was implying. Wasn't she reminding the Chen family about Yun Shi saving Chen's life, so they'd not forget to repay the Yuns? Liang Xiuqin hadn't even wanted to accept this daughter yesterday, yet she was shameless enough to use Yun Shi's help to elicit favors from them today. Who did she even think she was? Jiang Wanyun hadn't had a very good impression of Liang Xiuqin to begin with, but now she looked at her with an extremely disgusted expression. As a rich heiress and wife of a wealthy family, she wasn't in a position to say harsh things. Instead, she pretended to not hear Liang Xiuqin and completely ignored her. By the arch, Chen put both hands in his pockets as he lazily leaned against the wall. His dark eyes fell upon Yun Shi's face that was eager to watch her mother suffer. Chapter 48. You are listening at novelfull.audio. All hail Mr. Chen. Eddie et Jiang Wanyun's disdain and refusal to acknowledge her, along with everyone's silence, directly caused Liang Xiuqin to get the wrong idea. She instinctively thought that Yun Shi had done something inappropriate to offend Jiang Wanyun. Suddenly, Liang Xiuqin's expression turned very ugly as well. With a stony face, she turned around to Yun Shi to harshly scold her directly. Her sharp nails stabbed against Yun Shi's forehead, and with her fiery temper, her poor mannerisms as a country bumpkin were instantly revealed. Wretched girl! You don't even know any manners. You think a country girl like you can go offend certain people as you please. How on earth did your uncle and auntie raise you? You have a pair of eyes, but you don't even know how to read people. Hurry up and apologize humbly to Mrs. Chen. If she doesn't forgive you, then I'll have you kneel here to beg for her forgiveness. Otherwise, don't you even dream of going home. Liang Xiuqin hadn't even figured out the situation, but her first reaction was to push the blame on Yun Shi. She was thinking about how she'd take advantage of this situation to teach Yunxi a lesson and vent her frustrations. At the same time, she could also flatter Jiang Wanyun to minimize the trouble and hit two birds with one stone. Liang Xiuqin's anger flared when she saw Yunxi keep her head down and stay silent. Yun Yuanfeng was the most strict with his family right now. Regardless if it was the Jiangs or the Chens, they took up the majority of the high official positions in Jingdu and possessed absolute power. If they even slightly offended these people, the consequences would be disastrous. This Star of Death was truly useless. She was nothing in comparison with her other two obedient daughters. What are you standing there for? Hurry up and go over there. Yunxi frowned slightly. After being reborn, her mother's ability to cause trouble hadn't diminished at all. Although this wasn't the first time she saw this was their first battle against each other. Yunxi didn't want to lose the fight just like that. She suddenly looked up and shot an icy glare at Liang Xiuqin's harsh and belligerent face. Her watery eyes seeped with coldness. Her dark, bottomless eyes flashed, and the icy glint caused Liang Xiuqin to shiver controllably. Liang Xiuqin was scared by Yunxi's lethal look, so she grabbed Yunxi and pushed her toward the couch. What are you glaring at me for? Hurry up and go over there. Jiang Wanyun truly couldn't stand watching Liang Xiuqin act so harshly anymore. Just as she stood up to walk over there, Chen Chen had already straightened up from the arch and began walking over. Even if she offended someone, that person would be me. What does that have anything to do with you? Chen Chen walked up, and his harsh eyes swept toward Liang Xiuqin. His elegant and handsome face was ingrained with unconcealed disdain and disgust. You're the so-called biological mother who hasn't raised her for a day in over 10 years, so what right do you have to take advantage of the great favor the Chen family owes to Yunxi? You're shameless enough to elicit favors from us. Are you even worthy of that? Liang Xiuqin hadn't even opened her mouth to flatter Chen Chen when she saw him walking over. Instead, she was sternly berated, and her face turned pale before flushing. I heard that when Yunxi lived in the countryside, grandfather Yun was the one to send her monthly living allowances. You haven't even completed your duties as a mother for even one day, so what right do you have to stand here and scold Yunxi? His grandfather spared grandfather Yun's face by not humiliating him and making things awkward for both families. However, this didn't mean that Chen Chen was also good tempered enough to freely allow his savior to be bullied. This little creature was not a fool, nor was she weak. He could tell that she would launch a counter-attack. But he truly couldn't stand watching Liang Xiuqin's shrewd and harsh face. This woman was a world of difference from his own mother. With the contrast provided by Liang Xiuqin today, he finally realized that his own mother was a born-again saint. Mr. Chen. No, it's not as you're saying. It was this wretched girl. Liang Xiuqin wanted nothing more than to dig a hole in the ground after being so rudely exposed by a younger person. This was truly too humiliating. Chen Chen coldly shot a warning glance at her. Shut your mouth. Chen Chen had just become an adult, but he already possessed the authority and heroic spirit of an adult in his eyes. His naturally authoritative and commanding aura was enough to scare Liang Xiuqin into turning pale. Yunxi is my savior and the one who saved my life, not you. There's no need for you to elicit favors from us, nor will we accept anything from you. Chapter 49. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Plenty of caution. Yunxi turned around to look at Chen Chen with a look of admiration, her eyes sparkling with brilliant starlight. He was indeed one of the 5 heirs of the Jingdu, for he had impressive abilities to scold people. With merely a few words, he'd been able to scold her mother into humiliation. She had truly embarrassed herself and her husband today. Yunxi wondered if Liang Xiuqin would vomit 3 liters of blood once she went home and her head cooled down. Chen, don't be rude. Jiang Wanyun walked over to shake her head at her son. Although her son has said everything she'd wanted to, they couldn't humiliate grandfather Yun like that. He was still standing right there. Mrs. Yun Shi rescued our Chen Chen, and our family will always remember this favor. If Yun Shi asks us for anything in the future, we will do our best to help her. Jiang Wanyun had been around Mrs. Chen for so many years, so she could easily deal with a woman like Liang Shiqin. She made her words clear enough, both the literal and implied meaning referred to Yun Shi being the main subject. The Chens would have to repay their debt to Yun Shi, but not the Yun family. Nor was it for Liang Shiqin. Liang Shiqin wasn't able to elicit any favors at all, so her face turned pale with anger. She was so embarrassed that the smile nearly fell off her face. Grandfather Yun also thought that he was thoroughly humiliated before Grandfather Jiang and the Chen family, so he scoffed before glaring at Liang Shiqin. He knew all about Liang Shiqin's shrewdness and greed, but he had never seen someone too eager to humiliate themselves before the four great clans. Yun Shi gritted her teeth to keep her mouth close in order to painfully squash her urge to laugh. She put her hand behind her back and gave Chen Yichen a thumbs up. Chen Yichen eyed her tiny, pale hand and curled his lips into a subtle smile. Her slender fingers were finely shaped and so fair-skinned that he had the urge to give them a bite. His gloomy but handsome face had appeared harsh and aloof in the previous moment but now warmed slightly with a subtle beam of sunshine. "Grandfather, let's go home." Yun Shi turned around to chime in and break the awkwardness. There must always be someone acting as a peacemaker, and since she'd already achieved her goal of embarrassing her mother, she was in an extremely good mood. However, her mother was shameless enough and had the heart capacity to endure it. She had humiliated herself this time, yet she would be more than eager to try to flatter the Chens the next time she saw them. Yun Shi was already happy that Liang Shiqin hadn't been able to take advantage of her at all. The things that belonged to her could only belong to her. No one else should even dream of coveting them. Yun Shi gave Grandfather Yun an excuse to leave, so his expression eased slightly. With a sigh, he said goodbye to Grandfather Jiang. Before they left, Jiang Wanyun packed a few new outfits for Yun Shi and urged her to be more cautious from now on. Yun Shi felt touched and bittersweet. After being reborn to this life, she didn't have anything but plenty of caution. Yun Shi took out the jade pendant from her backpack to pass it to Jiang Wanyun. "Madam, can I ask you to help keep this safe for me? My mother really wants my second sister to marry into the Jiang family. I know that Grandfather Jiang loves me, but I'm worried in the future that..." Yun Shi didn't need to finish her sentence for Jiang Wanyun to understand her clearly. Liang Shiqin was someone who would allow her niece to replace her own daughter, so there was no question that she would steal a marriage that could earn access to the Jiang family. Since she disliked this daughter so much, she would undoubtedly have her favored daughter replace Yun Shi and marry into the Jiang family. Grandfather Jiang loved Yun Shi so much, so Jiang Wanyun was also worried that Liang Shiqin would anger him in the future and cause him to develop illness in his old age. "Very well then, I'll help you keep it safe. You can come and ask me for it when you want it back." Jiang Wanyun accepted the jade pendant and gently patted Yun Shi's thin and delicate shoulder. "Although our family has established an arranged marriage with you, we would never force you into anything. Study hard, and we can discuss the future later on." Although she also badly wanted Yun Shi to be her daughter.in.law, who knew what would happen in the future. No one could tell what fate had in store. Chapter 50. You are listening at novelfull.audio. She finally returned to her battlefield when Yun Shi stepped into the threshold of the Yun's home. She stood in the very familiar living room and finally felt like she was actually reborn. She was back again after all these years. Looking at the group of people sitting in the living room, her eyes quickly scanned around to see that the entire Yun family was here. Yun Shi wasn't surprised to see them at all. In fact, she felt some excitement and giddiness. It wasn't because of her affection for family, but because this was her battlefield. They were all her family, the family that hadn't given her any warmth in her previous lifetime. Today, they were all fish in her net. Compared to Liang Shiqin's ashamed and defeated look, Yun Shi was in a fairly good mood. After being introduced to everyone by her grandfather, she began to greet all her elders, one by one. Her grandfather had 3 sons but no daughters. His eldest son was Yun Shi's father, Yun Yuanfeng. In the course of more than 10 years, he had risen from a minor team leader to deputy director but hadn't been able to advance further. Yun Yuanfeng had 3 daughters, including Yun Shi. Yun Shi was the eldest, followed by Yun Xiling and Yun Chuhan. Yun Shi's second uncle suffered from frail health, but her second aunt was a strong woman. She came from an extraordinarily wealthy family, so no one dared to provoke her easily. There was one male discontent in the family, and he was her second uncle's precious son, Yun Haozhe. He was 3 years younger than Yun Shi and the same age as Yun Xiling. It was also because her second uncle had a son that caused Liang Xiuqin to hate Yun Shi even more for cursing her own son to death. Her third uncle, Yun Qingfeng, was a businessman and relied on his older brother's relationships. The 2 brothers collaborated and traversed throughout the business world for many years, so he was now regarded as one of the wealthiest men in Jingdu. Yun Qingfeng had one daughter, Yun Kersen. She was the same age as Yun Chuhan, yet she was grandfather Yun's favorite grandchild. After her third uncle made his fortune from business, he purchased 2 plots of land near the villa complex and built 2 villas, one for himself and one for grandfather Yun. Grandfather Yun was unaccustomed to living there, so he gave the house away to her second uncle. Liang Xiuqin had always been jealous of her third aunt's life of luxury, so she was beside herself with envy. Ever since then, a secret rift had been caused between her second aunt and Liang Xiuqin. After greeting everyone, Yun Shi finally locked her target on the only outsider, Liang Xini. Cousin came all this way to impersonate me. Now that things have been cleared up, I wonder what cousin plans to do. Liang Xini's expression became very ugly when she was exposed before all these people. Gritting her teeth, she glared at Yun Shi before hiding behind Liang Xiuqin to seek her help. Liang Xiuqin was pent up with anger to begin with, so she was free to abuse Yun Shi now. How could you speak to your cousin like that? What's wrong with me letting her stay in Jingdu? I only have to add another person to the dining table. Your uncle and aunt raised you for so many years. Now that their daughter has come to my home, of course I need to take care of her properly as her aunt. You've lived in the countryside for so long that you've become as shrewd and ignorant as a frog from the bottom of a well. As if you'll ever achieve anything. Yun Shi raised a brow and half smiled as she retorted, cousin has also lived in the countryside all this time, so we are certainly 2 disappointing frogs from the bottom of the well. Self-deprecation had already become a form of black humor in her age, so Yun Shi didn't mind it at all. However, Liang Xini was extremely angry about being dragged down with her. Liang Xiuqin's face turned white when she was beaten by Yun Shi. How could you insult your cousin like that? Is that how much you hate her being here? Don't you forget that you're in no place to make any decisions in this family? Yun Shi truly couldn't help rolling eyes. Just who was insulting whom? What is mom so concerned about? I never asked for cousin to go back home. Yun Shi turned to look at Liang Xini and smiled brightly and innocently. She smiled even more happily at the sight of Liang Xini's poisonous glare. After all, I've lived with cousin for so many years already. I'd also miss her if she left, and school is about to start next week. How about we let cousin stay in Jingdu so she can study here? Jingdu's educational resources are better than Muyang's, so cousin will certainly achieve success. Also, since mom takes care of cousin so well, wouldn't mom have another daughter to serve you once cousin achieves success?